Join the Comgiverse Patreon for exclusive content, behind-the-scenes access, and special perks. Support the channel and connect with a community of revolutionary intellectuals and scholars. Click the link in the description to join now.
But Snoop, why do you like cannabis so much? Like, what is it? Like, I mean, it's been such a huge part of your brand. I just would be interested to hear, like, why?
I should take you to my green room.
I'm fine with that, maybe after this.
Nah, well, for one, I enjoy it for medical reasons.
Trouble sleeping?
And I mean, it's a peace situation with me. Every time that I've always been around it, I've seen beautiful things happen. I've seen people, you know, manifest love, peace, and happiness and harmony. And I've always been, an advocate for it. And now that I can see that it becomes more of a business and it's more educational and it's more, technical with the whole world in general, it gives off more than just me just trying to smoke, but me giving you a whole explanation of what it is. If you want to learn about it, if you want to get some insight about it, we'll provide you with all the information that you need to know. We'll be like the encyclopedia to the cannabis world.
Cool.
If the plant was a person, that shit'd be black.
Without a doubt. It's 100.
Feel me? Listen, it was
100%.
beloved. It's beloved where it was from. You know what I'm saying? They loved it where it was starting at naturally, right? Loved it. It was beautiful. It was enjoying itself. Somebody snatched it, brought it somewhere it didn't want to be, right? They used it up, right? Act like they weren't fucking with it. You know what I'm saying? Then when they've realized, oh, we don't want it no more, they tried to discard it. But people still loved it secretly. You know what I'm saying? Couldn't get rid of it. Then when they realized they couldn't get rid of it, what they do? They legalized it. And am I talking about black people or am I talking about weed? You don't even know. You don't even know because it's the same journey. You know what I'm saying? And I think it's a divine connection with us in cannabis, bro. And that's why we really need to be doing this shit so that we can really capitalize on that.
Marijuana's origins trace back to South Asia, where it has been used for 4,000 years. The knowledge of cannabis from South Asia spread to East Africa around 2,000 years ago. Before reaching the Americas, cannabis traveled across Africa, where it evolved both as a plant and as a drug. African traditions and experiences form another foundational layer for the current cannabis cultures. Notably, in Africa, cannabis became part of local practices that already included pipe smoking, whereas in Asia, it was traditionally consumed orally. This chapter explores these dual origins, while Chapter 4 discusses the spread of cannabis within the continent. To start, it's important to understand the research methods involved. Scholars reconstruct the history of plant dispersal by examining ancient plant remains and human-related evidence, such as language, artifacts, and written records. Humans play a key role in the spread of domesticated plants, making human-centered evidence vital for studying crops like cannabis. Direct evidence of ancient plant presence is raw due to the decomposition of organic material. Although hemp seeds have been found throughout temperate Eurasia, none have been discovered in Africa. Pollen can be preserved in lake-bottom sediments, but it is challenging to interpret because cannabis pollen is abundant and wind-borne, potentially traveling far from its origin. Moreover, cannabis pollen grains resemble those of related plants, such as hops, and certain trees in the genus Celtis, leading experts to identify them as cannabis-type grains, rather than specifically from the cannabis genus. Human-related evidence is often plentiful for domesticated plants. Historical records frequently mention plants, though not consistently across all species, locations, or time periods. Technological artifacts can also indicate past interactions between people and plants. Archaeologists have found numerous pipes in Africa, suggesting prehistoric smoking practices, though only one pipe from the 14th century can be directly linked to cannabis. The terminology people use for plants and related technologies can indicate dispersal pathways when viewed as geographic and linguistic data. I have gathered many terms for cannabis, tobacco, and smoking pipes in African languages to study the plant's history. However, my language data have limitations. I relied on published materials, which allowed me to access information across many languages but also made me dependent on non-linguist researchers with different questions. Many sources are pre-1930 dictionaries, aligning with my historical focus but making the data somewhat outdated. Other sources are recent ethnobotanical studies, though contemporary terms may not have been used in the past. Published sources often use non-standardized orthography and lack detailed grammatical and syntactical information. Those who compiled word lists, such as scientists, missionaries, and colonial administrators, typically provided only rough pronunciations and single-word definitions. The predominance of pre-1930 data reflects the global shift in smoking practices after 1890. When machine-rolled cigarettes became more popular. In Africa, pipe smoking declined over the ensuing decades, and pipe-related vocabulary similarly decreased. Cannabis smoking was banned in most of Africa before 1925, driving cannabis knowledge underground and leading to significant changes since the 1960s due to global popular culture influences. Nowadays, Africans use global terms like marijuana, hashish, ganja, and weed, though many indigenous words remain in use. Despite these challenges, linguistic data are valuable for understanding historical plant distributions. Since 1867, scholars have used language geography to trace the spread of psychoactive cannabis. Current knowledge of cannabis dispersal in Africa primarily relies on linguistic evidence. I have compiled cannabis terms in 164 languages, tobacco terms in 301, and pipe names in 175 languages. For context, Africa is home to between 1,500 and 2,000 indigenous languages. In comparison, the most comprehensive studies of cannabis language geography have considered 15 or fewer languages. Additionally, all studies have assumed that the Hindi word bhang is the ultimate root of all infra-Saharan terms, based on the belief that the plant came to the region from South Asia under this name. Scholars have created etymologies to connect African words to bhang, rather than analyzing the words independently of these assumptions. I have found no reasonable connections between bhang and most of the cannabis words I have identified. Moreover, I have also examined pipe and tobacco words in my analysis. These terms provide evidence of the relationship between the practice of smoking and the histories of the two smokable herbs. I discuss pipe terms further in the next chapter and mention tobacco words at several points. My detailed data and analyses are available elsewhere, and I summarize them here. South Asian cultural foundations. Bhang is a crucial word for understanding the plant's history in Africa, even if it is not the root of most of the continent's cannabis names. In Hindi, bhang has three overlapping meanings. It is the name of the cannabis plant. It refers to dried herbal material. And it is the name of a psychoactive drink made from this material. Bhang is the most basic psychoactive cannabis product, a mix of dried leaves, flowers, seeds, and stems used to make edible and smoked products. Two other Hindi terms are also important. Charas and ganja are concentrated forms of the plant drug. THC is most densely accumulated in pistillate inflorescences, particularly in the resinous hairs covering them. Ganja means pistillate inflorescences of cannabis in Hindi, while charas refers to cannabis resin. Marijuana enthusiasts associate charas and ganja with the folk species indica and sativa, respectively. The ideal images of these folk species are that indica plants were originally hashish cultivars, bred to be short for resin collection by rubbing against the plants, while sativa plants are tall-growing ganja cultivars. These ideal types correspond to the wide leaflet and narrow leaflet drug varieties named by botanists. Despite these idealized forms, enthusiasts identify the folk species based on subjective effects, not appearance. The folk species indica yields sedative-like effects, while sativa produces stimulant-like highs. Marijuana enthusiasts consider infra-Saharan cannabis cultivars to belong to the stimulant-like sativa folk species, similar to ganja plants in India. These three basic psychoactive products have long histories and distinct geographies in southern Asia. In India, bhang was historically most prominent in the central lowlands and the coast facing westward toward the Arabian Sea. The word was recorded around 1000 BCE in the Hindu text Atharva Veda, and cognate words appeared in several ancient South Asian languages, though their specific meanings are often uncertain. For instance, in Old Arabic, before 700 CE, banj referred generically to any psychoactive plant, particularly cannabis, datura stramonium, and henbane, Hyoscyamus niger. Knowledge of bhang prominently circulated in the Western Indian Ocean during ancient times, with little evidence that people in Europe or Southeast Asia gained this knowledge. In the first millennium CE, people began sailing across the Arabian Sea on seasonal monsoon winds, from Western India toward southern Arabia, the Red Sea, and East Africa's Swahili coast. Sailors likely played a key role in bhang's ancient Arabian Sea crossing, although evidence of this only appears in the 1600s when shipmasters supplied tobacco, opium, and cannabis to sailors, along with rice and copper coins. A 1765 shipwreck off Egypt's northern Red Sea coast yielded both dry pipes and water pipes. The dry pipes were likely for tobacco, the water pipes for cannabis or opium. Bhang cognates are found around the Red Sea. The Arabic bango, meaning psychoactive cannabis, herbal material, is spoken in Sudan, Yemen, and Egypt. Charas was principally produced in the mid-elevation Hindu Kush and neighboring ranges in the present-day borderlands of Nepal, India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and China. Charas likely arose as a byproduct of harvesting cannabis for other uses. Cannabis is a sticky, resinous plant, and the basic technique of hash production is to collect resin accumulated on the hands. Both charas and ganja have been produced for over 2 millennia, though the histories are unclear before 1500 CE. Plant genetics provide evidence for their antiquity. These products involve different agricultural selection methods. Ganja farmers saved seeds based on individual plant characteristics known from harvested inflorescences. Charas farmers selected seeds at the field level, as resin was collected from many plants rather than individuals. The ancient application of these selection practices produced two genetically distinct varieties of cannabis indica, with genetic markers linked to individual level versus field level selection. The plant and knowledge of charas production traveled along the ridge of mountain ranges from the Himalayas to Turkey. In the Mediterranean basin, cannabis resin became best known as Turkish ezra and Levantine Arabic hashish and shira. Turkey, Syria, and Greece were principal commercial producers of hashish in the 18th and 19th centuries, supplemented by charas brought from South Asia through the Red Sea and Suez Canal. Ganja strains are adapted to hot subtropical and tropical growing conditions. During the 1300s and 1400s CE, books from the eastern and western Ganges Valley listed ganja as a synonym for bhang. This form of the plant drug became associated with the eastern end of the valley, in present-day Bangladesh and India's Bengal state, and the southern third of the Indian subcontinent. Knowledge of ganja crossed the Bay of Bengal to Southeast Asia by the 17th century, probably via trade. In the late 1600s, an English sailor reported that banga groweth in many places of this coast, central eastern India, but ganga is brought from the island Sumatra. From Southeast Asia to southern India, historical common names for cannabis were mostly ganja cognates, including Bahasa Malay ganja, first recorded in Indonesia in the late 1600s, Sinhala Komsa, documented in Ceylon in 1689, and Malayalam Gansho, used in southwestern India in 1747. In Chapter 4, I explore how these Asian geographies suggest cultural linkages across the Indian Ocean to Africa. Here, I note that bang cognates link northeastern Africa with South Asia. The word charas was replaced by other terms in the Mediterranean basin. But the practice of hashish consumption connects parts of North Africa to the highlands between Turkey and Nepal. Finally, ganja echoes faintly across the Indian Ocean in cannabis names recorded in Madagascar and Mozambique, as well as in the smoking paraphernalia characteristic of Southeast Asia and Southeastern Africa. African technological foundations. If you are familiar with cannabis smoking in the United States, you are probably aware of the bong. This technology has a global history. The bong can be traced back to US patent 4016,785, water pipe or bong, registered in 1980. The patent built on the bamboo-based water pipes that Vietnam-era US soldiers encountered in Southeast Asia. The word bong entered the American vocabulary around 1972, originating from words like Khmer Ba Bong, bamboo water pipe. The history of Southeast Asian bamboo-based water pipes remains unknown, but the bamboo tradition differs from the clay pot, glass jar, and coconut husk pipe traditions evident in South Asia. The global center of bamboo pipe diversity is across the Indian Ocean in southeastern Africa. The earliest documentation of a bamboo water pipe is from the Comoro Islands in 1626. Identical pipes were smoked in South Africa around 1790. In Madagascar, around 1720, people used bamboo-based dry pipes. Other bamboo-based pipes were documented during the 19th century in Mozambique, South Africa, Zambia, Tanzania, and elsewhere. Bamboo was integral to other early water pipes, connecting the pipe bowl to the water container. Water pipes with cattle horns as the water container were described in Madagascar, 1638, South Africa, 1775, and Mozambique, 1795. It is unclear how knowledge of bamboo-based pipes existed on opposite shores of the Indian Ocean, but all evidence indicates that the bong is ultimately from Africa, despite its recent history in Southeast Asia. Africans invented many variations of two basic technologies: water pipes and dry pipes. These technologies are designed to deliver a controlled stream of smoke to the user. Smoke is generated via combustion in the pipe bowl, then enters the pipe stem due to suction by the smoker. In water pipes, the stem enters water held in the pipe chamber. The user draws smoke through the water into the airspace within the chamber, then into the mouth. The water cools and filters the smoke. Dry pipes are simply tubes, usually with an upturned bowl at the end of the stem, which the smoker holds in their mouth. These technologies are simple enough to fabricate from almost any tube, any watertight container, and some form of a pipe bowl. Archaeological evidence shows that smoking is indigenous to Africa just as it is to the Americas. Pre-Columbian pipes have been found widely in infra-Saharan Africa from Chad to Ethiopia and South Africa. Near Lake Chad and in the lower Niger Delta, pipes as old as 600 BCE have been found, predating both tobacco and cannabis by 2,000 years. In Botswana, a dry pipe made from bone dates to around 700 CE, 1,000 years before the local written record for either plant. There is no evidence of what Africans smoked before cannabis, but many candidate plants exist. Datura, a genus that includes several species, was the most widespread. Datura smoke, allegedly, produces subjective effects similar to those of cannabis, but it is pharmacologically very different. It is highly toxic, and overdoses cause permanent injury or death. Most pre-Columbian pipes post-date 1000 CE, and most come from Eastern Africa. This apparent pattern of increased regional appearances of pipes during a specific period perhaps suggests the arrival of cannabis. Earlier pipe bowls generally had smaller capacity than later ones, implying conservative use of an uncommon substance. Pipe bowls expanded over time. The first certain evidence of cannabis smoking comes from pipes unearthed in Ethiopia that retained residue from about 1325 CE. Chemical evidence has not been found elsewhere. Historical geographies of African smoking pipes are poorly known. Archaeological evidence is important, but rather incomplete. Clay or stone pipe bowls are nearly all that survive in archaeological sites. Bowl shapes and ornamental designs suggest technological traditions. The angle between pipe stem and bowl is usually straight in water pipes and angled in dry pipes. Biodegradable components indicate different water pipe traditions, but these have not been reported from archaeological sites. Historical water pipe containers were mostly biodegradable, made of bamboo, calabash, coconut, horn, or wood. Some pipes were entirely biodegradable, such as dry pipes made from banana leaves. Earth pipes, formed entirely in the ground, had no manufactured components. Language geography suggests multiple inventions of smoking, although no pipe-related words have been recorded for most African languages, and published translations are generally poor and not helpful for identifying specific technologies. Nonetheless, three broad categories of pipe terms are evident: indigenous African words, others derived from Farsi or Turkish, and those borrowed from English pipe or its cognates in other European languages. This language pattern correlates to the distribution of distinct sets of paraphernalia and to histories of tobacco diffusion in Africa. Pipe vocabularies for the widespread Ngalanjam language family are well documented. These many languages, and some unrelated ones, share several root words. The shared vocabulary suggests that a distinct smoking pipe tradition originated among Proto-Ngalanjam-speaking peoples, perhaps associated with pre-Columbian pipes unearthed in eastern Central Africa. Distinctly different vocabularies exist in non-Ngalanjam languages and suggest separate inventions of smoking, perhaps in the Ethiopian highlands and the Lake Chad basin. Pre-Columbian pipes are known from both areas. Importantly, indigenous pipe vocabularies do not correspond to tobacco vocabularies or to the historical biogeographies of the tobacco species Nicotiana tabacum and Nicotiana rustica, both introduced from the Americas after 1492. In most of the infra-Saharan region, tobacco and smoking have separate origins. The earliest pipes were probably the simplest, earth pipes that were a tube and bowl formed in the ground. Earth pipes were widespread in the southern half of the continent into the early 1900s. Other early pipes were probably made of hollow bones. An 8th century example has been recovered in Botswana. In historical times, bone pipes were documented in Ethiopia and South Africa, where they were abandoned once manufactured. European-style pipes became commercially available. Stone and clay pipe bowls are clearly and widely ancient because they persist in archaeological contexts. Stone pipes remained in use in the 1800s in South Africa and into the 1950s in Tanzania. Clay pipe bowls are still made widely, though uncommonly. Historically, in most locations, people used multiple technologies. In South Africa, for instance, in 1790, people made pipe bowls from baked clay and carved soapstone, with dry pipe stems made of reeds or bamboo and water pipe containers made of bamboo or horn. Bamboo and horn-based pipes were documented primarily in the southeast. The earliest account of cannabis smoking was from Madagascar around 1720, with bamboo-based dry pipes. Such pipes remained in use with cannabis into the 1930s. Similar dry pipes were documented near Cape Town, South Africa, around 1790. Liberated slaves from Angola and Mozambique made a bamboo-based pipe on mid-Atlantic St. Helena Island in 1843. Most water pipes in South Africa were made of horns. Other types of water pipes were more prominent elsewhere. Coconut-based pipes were recorded being used with cannabis from Tanzania to Egypt and Algeria. Calabash-based water pipes were most prominent in Western Africa. They were documented earliest in Angola in 1832, and their use was widespread, from Sierra Leone to South Africa, in the late 1800s. People also carved water pipe containers from wood, and by 1900 were fashioning pipes from bottles and cans. The second group of pipe words are Farsi or Turkish loanwords used in North Africa, most notably in Arabic. The historical meanings of most words are best known from 19th century Egypt. Shisha or shisha in English were water pipes based on ornate glass jars with long flexible hoses for inhaling smoke. The name came from the Farsi word for glass. Nargile or nargile in English also had flexible drawing tubes but used conical ceramic water containers held in metal floor stands. Although the Farsi root of nargile means coconut, Egyptian pipes truly made of husks were called goze, the Arabic word for coconut. Goze did not have floor stands and had reeds or wooden pipes, not hoses as drawing tubes. Finally, dry pipes, called shibuk, a Turkish word written as chibuk in English, were for tobacco. These ornate pipes had 4-foot-long stems wrapped and tasseled with silk thread and tipped with mouthpieces of semi-precious stone. Based on the root meanings of nargile and goze, ceramic and glass water pipes were innovations on coconut-based water pipes. There is not enough evidence to pinpoint where coconut-based pipes originated, but it seems that ceramic and glass pipes were first produced in the Levant, probably during the 1500s. Coconut-based water pipes were never prominent in southwestern Asia. They were documented later than glass jar and clay pot pipes in that region. Portuguese sailors had encountered coconut-based pipes somewhere in the Indian Ocean by the mid-1600s because they appeared in the Portuguese Atlantic soon afterward. Indeed, the earliest description of a coconut-based water pipe is, quite remarkably, from the Cape Verde Islands in the Central Atlantic Ocean in 1672. These islands were nodes along Portugal's primary shipping route into the Indian Ocean, where traders were especially active in East Africa, Mozambique, Madagascar, and the Comoros, and India. Coconut palms dispersed with people along 2 pathways in the Indian Ocean, from the Indonesian islands to Madagascar and the Comoros, then to mainland East Africa, and second, from Indonesia to India, then southern Arabia. Along the northern pathway, the plant was likely domesticated in India 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. Coconut fruits were known in Persia during the first millennium CE as imported items. The country's climate is too cold and dry for the plant, which reaches its distribution limit south of the Persian. Altogether, evidence suggests an undocumented arrival in the Levant of a package of knowledge and technology centered on smoking cannabis in coconut-based water pipes, possibly around 1500. Ceramic and glass water pipe containers were Levantine innovations that emerged later, coinciding with the arrival of tobacco. The new plant and the technological innovation became more prestigious than the older cannabis-coconut combination. In the 1750s, in India, the 1780s in Algeria, the 1790s in Syria, and the 1830s in Egypt, coconut-based water pipes were associated with hashish and poorer smokers, while glass and ceramic pipes were associated with tobacco and the upper class. The less major pattern in pipe language geography is that derivatives of the English word pipe ring the continent. These terms are most prominent in West Africa, where smoking was absent before pipes and tobacco arrived on European ships in the 1500s. The pipe types Europeans brought are traceable to specific parts of the New World. European-made pipes quickly became widespread trade items, and African artisans soon began reproducing and embellishing imported designs, establishing distinctive industries. Imported and derivative designs were widely associated with tobacco. In 1798, an Englishman in Mozambique observed men and women smoking tobacco from locally made iron pipes that resembled common tobacco pipes. However, men smoked cannabis in horn-based water pipes, which were novel to the Englishmen. Pipe knowledge is diverse and deeply embedded in African and American Indian languages and cultures, unlike in Eurasia, where claims of pre-Columbian pipes are at best dubious, with two exceptions. Unexplained containers from Persia and Arabia, dating as early as the 1300s, resemble historical nargile containers, and Persian documents hint that smoking was known in the late 1400s. However, the earliest known pipe bowls in the Levant post-date tobacco. If these earlier containers were water pipes, they likely derived from African precedents. In highland Southeast Asia, archaeologists have unearthed a few ceramic pipes that may date to the 11th century. Though these dry pipes were not part of an enduring tradition, while ancient Eurasian people purposefully inhaled smoke, it was via inefficient technologies like fumigated tents and face-sized chimneys. Pipes allow efficient smoke inhalation and enable precise control of drug dosage, which is significant for cannabis as smoked cannabis acts faster and dosages are harder to manage via oral ingestion. Thus, smoking has become the globally dominant form of cannabis ingestion, ultimately an African innovation. Many people worldwide first encountered smoking via African technologies, including all-water pipes. African dry pipes have been important too, although American Indian technologies called pipe by 16th century Englishmen were more widely adopted, along with tobacco. The global importance of American Indian paraphernalia is significant, but words for smoking pipes in nearly all European languages derive from pipe, except the Portuguese word cachimbo. This term likely originated from the lower Zambezi Valley, where several languages share words for dry pipe, similar to Chichewa cachimbo. By 1514, Portuguese adventurers had traveled extensively up the Zambezi, likely learning to smoke along the way. The Portuguese term cachimbo circulated widely in the Atlantic, entering Spanish, French, and Occitan languages to label the pipes of sailors. The pipes of historical Portuguese sailors, typically made of red clay with separate stems of reeds, differed from other European pipes, which were mostly white clay pipes with integrated clay stems. By 1800, Europeans regarded red clay pipes and the word cachimbo as indicative of Negro smoking practices. Although cachimbo remains the Portuguese word for all smoking pipes and has influenced terms in Atlantic Central Africa and the Americas. African languages that adopted cachimbo as a loanword also have other pipe terms, especially for water pipes. In northern Angola, for example, the Vili term for a calabash-based water pipe, inkondo, comes from a widespread Ngalanjam root, while dry pipes were historically called timba, derived from cachimbo. These pipes were associated with different plants, with a Vili proverb advising the appropriate use: tobacco in the timba and cannabis in the enkondo. Smoking was crucial for many Africans. Historical water pipes were mostly small and lightweight, unlike the cumbersome shishas and nargiles of the Levant. A German traveler in Zambia noted that men always carried their pipes while traveling or working in the fields. Travelers often carried dry pipes, which were smaller and did not require water, or just pipe bowls to attach to expedient stems. Expedient bowls of fresh clay meant even less to carry. Pipes made of banana petioles were easily made and disposable, and baobab shell water pipes, made from the fruit of a widespread wild tree, were used from Zambia to the lower Congo. The most mobile were earth pipes, made entirely in the soil, which allowed smoking anywhere herbs, fire, and dirt were available. These pipes, despite being ridiculed as primitive, were simple and efficient, allowing African pipes to remain valuable as contexts of consumption changed. Laborers and surreptitious smokers used them to avoid carrying extra or incriminating paraphernalia. The compact form of cachimbo-type pipes made them discreet for carrying, and cannabis-specific dry pipes remained small. The bong, a water pipe, uses plastic to mimic bamboo and is based on a US patent that does not acknowledge African technologies. The patented bong claims to solve the problem of inadequate smoke control with a second stem that enters the water. However, African prior art, documented in 1832 in central Angola, already featured a carb hole above the waterline, making it more efficient. The Central African design, which allows easier clearing of smoke, was recognized by a Portuguese traveler in 1890 as evidence of Africa's ancient custom of narcotizing with smoke. Most people outside Africa came to know water pipes through Asian technologies like the hookah and the bong, but African knowledge is foundational. Orientalist fixation on cannabis in the Levant made shishas and nargilés the prototypical water pipes in European thought. And racist dismissiveness of African technological capabilities led Europeans to view African pipes as primitive imitations. Yet, the technology to smoke cannabis in Ethiopia 700 years ago remains in use today. African technologies have long surpassed the capabilities of modern patents and lie at the root of the world's dominant mode of cannabis use as a smoke drug. Cannabis came to Africa from Southern Asia, where it originated, alongside knowledge of its psychoactive use. However, the techniques of cannabis processing and consumption known in Southern Asia fared poorly in Africa. Africans discovered that their smoking technologies transformed the drug into a fast-acting, easily dosed pharmacological agent. Cannabis cultures varied within Southern Asia and Africa, shaped by different cultural, social, and environmental contexts. The plant followed multiple dispersal pathways into Africa and traveled several routes across the continent. Cannabis arrives. Two broad pathways into Africa are evident. In North Africa, cannabis arrived through connections in the eastern Mediterranean region. South of the Sahara, it came across the Indian Ocean to eastern Africa. The earliest cannabis type, pollen, recovered in Africa from northwestern Botswana around 1800 BCE, does not fit these pathways. There are no known human connections between Asia and southern Africa at that time. The nearest evidence is a few pollen grains from the Nile Delta in Kemet, with the closest strong proof coming from southern Central Asia. In southern Africa, the next evidence of cannabis is from a Portuguese account of Mozambique in the 1580s. There are no records from Botswana until the late 1800s. Koena and Proto-Koena speakers have likely always occupied the area where the pollen was found, although the arrival of Ngalanjam peoples altered southern African cultural geography between 1000 and 1600 CE. Smoking seems ancient in Botswana, where a simple dry pipe made of bone was found dating to 700 CE. Slightly younger pipes from Zambia were likely associated with early Ngalanjam peoples. Another faint suggestion of an early cannabis culture is that Koena cannabis vocabularies are not related to words in other language families. The word daga, from an unknown Western Cape Koena language, has been dominant in South Africa for centuries. Since 1900, similar terms have been recorded in several Koena languages. Other distinctive plant names south of the Sahara include Tswana, Matokwane, Botswana, Xhosa, Umya, South Africa, and Rwanda Urumogi, Rwanda. These distinctive words likely reflect more recent developments rather than remnants of ancient traditions. Madagascar is a more certain source of cannabis culture. Sites near the island's center have yielded pollen from around 300 BCE, associated with unknown settlers. Cannabis pollen became abundant there about 800 CE, when the ancestors of today's Malagasy arrived from Indonesia. The Malagasy language historically had a diverse vocabulary for cannabis and smoking. The plant drug was first documented on Madagascar in 1661, mentioned again around 1720, and abundantly documented after 1880. The most informative Malagasy plant names suggest connections between cannabis cultures on the island and elsewhere. The oldest forms of Malagasy, spoken in the southeast, include the word ahetsmanga. This term might echo a word carried across the Indian Ocean by early settlers. The earliest known name for cannabis in Indonesia is ganja, borrowed from Hindi into Bahasa Malay by 1747. Ganja remained common in Southeast Asia into the 1900s, with bang recorded as an uncommon Malay word for cannabis leaves in 1870. In Malagasy, ahets means plant, suggesting that ahets manga might mean banga plant. Other plant words crossed the ocean with the island's first settlers. It is a stretch to suggest that ganja is related to the Malagasy words jamala or jia. This implies early knowledge sharing between the Bay of Bengal and Madagascar, similar to the cultural connections hinted at by the distribution of bamboo-based pipes. What can be more confidently stated about Malagasy vocabulary is that it shows cultural connections between Madagascar and mainland Africa. Cannabis histories have not considered that cannabis cultures might be related across the Mozambique Channel, which is 260 miles wide at its narrowest point. Similar cannabis names and pipe technologies exist on both sides of the channel, in Madagascar and Mozambique, where people have traveled continuously for a millennium. A significant group of migrants were slaves, particularly those transported from the mainland and called Mozambiki in Malagasy. The number of people who experienced captive migration increased after 1500, with tens of thousands shipped from Mozambique to the Comoro Islands, Madagascar, Réunion, and Mauritius. Slaves did not necessarily establish linkages between mainland and Malagasy cannabis cultures, but they certainly strengthened them. Slaves carried terminology eastward from Madagascar. In Réunion Island Creole, cannabis is zamal, derived from jamala, the word captives spoke in the 1700s. Knowledge exchange with the mainland would have occurred much earlier. Among Malagasy cannabis words, soroma is distinctive because it lacks a J sound. The word was first published in 1883, spoken in 1895 in an unknown language at Quelimane, a port in central Mozambique, and simultaneously 1,000 miles north, in the Mochi language, northern Tanzania. The plant drug was called suruma in colonial Mozambique's 1914 law that banned it. In 2005, Indau speakers used the term near the Zimbabwe-Mozambique border. It is unclear when or how these connections originated. Jamala and Jia exemplify a widespread phonetic feature of African words for cannabis, the J sound. Words in many languages share this sound, spelled variously depending on orthographic conventions in European alphabets, pronunciation variations among native speakers, and listeners' ability to hear and portray unfamiliar sounds. The J terms fall into two categories: those with a medial M sound, e.g. Jamala, and those without, e.g. Jia. The mainland terms without an M are clustered around Uganda in many unrelated languages. The M words are widely dispersed, notably in a linear cluster across the continent from Mozambique to Gabon, and in an isolated cluster centered on Sierra Leone. Many M terms also include a B sound, such as Yauchamba, Malawi. The distribution of putative cognates of Jamala, Jia, and Soroma shows knowledge exchange between Madagascar and the mainland. It is likely that knowledge initially went from Madagascar to the mainland before Mozambique slaves began traveling east. Madagascar lies on a human migration pathway between the mainland and the plant's southern Asian area of origin, and cannabis has had an apparently continuous presence on the island for at least 200 years. Somehow, cannabis crossed the ocean to Madagascar, but there are only faint echoes, if any at all, suggesting where the transoceanic seeds might have originated. Assuming knowledge crossed the Mozambique Channel from island to mainland, it generally passed northward and westward from its landfall. Unfortunately, there are few historical accounts of cannabis from East African areas, where the putative cognates of Jamala, Jia, and Soroma are spoken, and no evidence for dispersal processes in that region. Sediments from one location in Kenya have yielded cannabis pollen from about 1500 CE. Although associated plants, cereal grasses and various weeds first appeared around 600 BCE. Cannabis seems more ancient in East Africa than 1500, but there is only circumstantial evidence of this. Pipe bowls recovered in southern Zambia were radiocarbon dated to 1200 CE. Sites in Zimbabwe and Kenya have yielded bowls that seem roughly contemporaneous, though dated only in relative terms based on archaeological stratigraphy. Pipes, including one with cannabis residue, have been recovered from 14th century Ethiopia. Eastern African cannabis cultures seem deeply rooted. In Kenya, in the 1980s, Luo speakers associated Njaga with their ancestors, but this says nothing about how or when the plant or knowledge of its use arrived. Diverse cannabis vocabularies were documented before 1915 in several southeastern African languages. In Malagasy, there were at least 4 named varieties of cannabis, 7 words, including 3 figurative terms, for cannabis, farm for smoking, and more than a dozen terms to discuss the processing of cannabis fiber. Speakers of Chichewa, Malawi, could discuss several cannabis varieties, including one grown for oilseed. Different grades of cannabis, inflorescences, harvested for smoking, and various plant parts, including staminate and pistillate flowers. Zulu speakers, South Africa, could name at least 4 grades of cannabis harvested for smoking. The Nyamwezi language, Tanzania, had terms for several aspects of cannabis use, including the cough of the hemp smoker. The plant and its use seemingly have long histories in southeastern Africa, but these histories are essentially unknown. The obvious linguistic indication that cannabis came to the continent from southern Asia are the many African cognates of Hindi Bahang, most notably Swahili Bangi. For 150 years, historians and geographers have identified maritime trade across the Arabian Sea as the pathway cannabis followed to Africa. Some knowledge of the plant indubitably came from Asia. However, evidence for the Bhang to Africa dispersal is imprecise and limited. First, although maritime commerce between South Asia and East Africa began early in the first millennium CE, the only known record of Bhang commerce is from 1872. The plant may have been a fellow traveler, if not a trade good, but the earliest known mention of Bhang in Swahili sources is from 1722. This source tells us only that a member of a prominent trading family used Bhang in Oman, on the southeastern corner of the Arabian Peninsula, when the family was active in Zanzibar. Second, Bhang cognates cannot provide certain evidence of cultural linkages. Many languages share morphologically similar names for the plant, as well as for products harvested from it. Cannabis traveled as Hindi bong, as well as Farsi bong, Arabic bonj, which generically meant plant intoxicant, and Arabic bongo, more narrowly meaning herbal, psychoactive cannabis. The Swahili word bangi is borrowed from Hindi, Farsi, or Arabic. Further, Europeans in South Asia consumed cannabis before 1540. The archaic Portuguese plant names banga and bangue, pronounced like bangi, were borrowed from Hindi or Swahili. Another complication is that Portuguese bangue and Hindi bang entered into English by 1700. Many Bangi cognates in East African languages came through direct contact with Swahili speakers, while others came via indirect contact as knowledge passed overland from one group to another. Direct Swahili influence remained closely limited to the coast until the 1800s, when traders began to travel with westward caravans. Some cognates reflect language shift, in which Bangi supplanted earlier names in locations where the plant drug was already known. Language shift is suggested in several East African languages that historically retained Bangi alongside unrelated words. Other than cognate words, Southern Asian inheritance are not obvious. Cannabis has supplied edible drugs in South Asia for 4,000 years. It has been smoked in Eastern Africa since at least the 1300s. The first infra-Saharan documentation of cannabis is a Portuguese account of Bangue at the mouth of the Zambezi, central Mozambique, in the 1580s. Arabs, Persians, and Swahilis had traded there since the 700s CE, and the Portuguese since 1498. The document records oral consumption of cannabis in a manner similar to what the English sailor Robert Knox learned in Ceylon in the 1660s, when he washed down dried leaves with water. The leaves were probably mixed with flowers and roasted, not simply dried. There are few other records of edible cannabis in infra-Saharan Africa, and they were published only around 1900. Bhang cognates circulated widely, but South Asian knowledge of Bhang uses did not. The singular location where Asian connections persisted was Zanzibar Island, Tanzania, where drug consumption remained characteristic of the Arabian Sea region generally. In 1872, Richard Burton contrasted Zanzibaris and mainlanders, writing that the Arab on Zanzibar appreciated opium, imported alcohol, and bhang in its several edible forms, imported from Bombay and Kutch, Western India. Otherwise, the plant drug's Southern Asian cultural roots were almost completely lost in infra-Saharan Africa. Historical cannabis cultures in North Africa maintain clear links to Levantine Asia. Perhaps the pharaohs oversaw Africa's first cannabis culture. Trade connected the ancient Kemites to places far to the northeast, where cannabis grew millennia before the pharaohs. A few pollen grains have survived from between 1200 and 2500 BCE. The sparsity of pollen suggests it blew to the lower Nile from across the Mediterranean. The tomb of Akhenaten, from about 1300 BCE, yielded a wad of plant fiber that archaeologists have identified as cannabis. Advocates of pharaonic cannabis argue that the hieroglyphic medicinal plant shemshamt is cannabis, primarily because shemshamt was described as a plant from which ropes are made. In Coptic, the language descended from ancient Metramenke May, cannabis was called Erbici in the 1700s CE. The kingdom of Kush, centered in what is now Sudan, overtook pharaonic Kemet around 700 BCE. Meritic, the extinct language of Kush, probably belonged to the Nilo-Saharan language family. Words for cannabis in extant Nilo-Saharan languages are examples of J-type, infra-Saharan terms, such as Luwonjaga and Lugbaran-Zai, South Sudan. The earliest firm evidence of cannabis in North Africa is from the Maghreb, the continent's northwestern region, where indigenous Berber languages are spoken. The Maghreb also hosts North Africa's most distinctive cannabis cultures. Cannabis-type pollen from 300 CE has been recovered in northern Morocco's Rif Mountains, although it became abundant there only after 1000 CE. Cannabis meaningfully arrived in the Mediterranean via Greece in the 400s BCE. The Greeks had not earlier known the plant they called cannabis and valued for hemp fiber. Evidence of its medicinal use among Greeks dates to the 1st century CE in the works of Dioscorides and Galen. Greek medicinal preparations of cannabis were non-psychoactive, although the Greeks vaguely knew of psychoactive uses in the Levant. During the Islamic Golden Age, 800s, 1400s, cannabis was called chinab in Arabic and grown widely, primarily to supply non-psychoactive medicines. Names for the plant across Mediterranean Europe derive from the Greek, and Arabic kinab probably does too. Islamic medicine initially drew on Greek sources. North African kinab did not have obviously psychoactive applications. Islamic medical texts began describing psychoactive uses in the 12th century under the name Indian kinab. By the 1800s, kinab meant cannabis grown for fiber across North Africa, though this was never more than a marginal crop. It persisted meekly into the 1900s in Morocco. European seed was probably tried there. The French certainly planted their hemp seed in Algeria by 1866 and perhaps also in Tunisia. In the early 1700s, Morocco's small industry showed European influence. The complicated process of preparing hemp fiber paralleled European techniques developed millennia before. Maghrebi cannabis is genetically distinctive among African varieties because it is a cross between non-psychoactive sativa and psychoactive indica. North African knowledge of psychoactive uses traces to the Levant, where cannabis supplied mind-altering drugs by 1000 BCE. The earliest documentary evidence is Galen's description from 100 CE of edible drugs in what is now Syria or Turkey. There are many stories in the cannabis literature about Persia as a font of global cannabis culture. Psychoactive cannabis was earliest evinced in Persia in the Zoroastrian text Denkart, compiled in the 900s CE, which ascribed religious meaning to a hallucinogenic beverage, bang, made from cannabis, datura, and/or henbane. The Denkard traditions predate its compilation by 1,000 years or more. The most familiar name for cannabis in Arabic has become hashish, which initially meant herbage, but became a nickname for cannabis meaning the herb. This name was used in Egypt by the 1200s, when people ate psychoactive concoctions in public gardens. Hashish referred to the plant and to masses of cannabis resin. Other words were sometimes used to name masses of resin in Mediterranean commerce, particularly Turkish esrar, Arabic shaira, and Hindi sharas. Although hashish was spoken wherever people spoke Arabic, in most of North Africa, this was not the drug plant's primary name. Europeans widely wrote hashish in travelogues, but hashish was its main local name only in Egypt. There is no known record of cannabis in the Horn of Africa before 1899, when colonial laws in Italian Eritrea prohibited hashish imports. In Amharic, the dominant language of Abyssinia, or historical Ethiopia, cannabis was historically Esha faris, plant of the Persians. It had the secondary name Esha tenbit, prophecy plant, and may have had an earlier name, Setatira. Archaeologists in Ethiopia have found chemical traces of cannabis in pipe bowls from around 1325 CE. But smoking was stigmatized in Ethiopian Christianity by 1700. European travelers rarely recorded smoking, whether cannabis or tobacco, but a German traveler observed hashish-based edibles on the northern Abyssinian frontier in 1866. In the 1920s, cannabis seemed sufficiently unknown in Abyssinia, and Abyssinians sufficiently abstemious that the French trafficker Henri de Montfrid considered it an ideal location to start growing his own, instead of smuggling supplies to Western Europe out of Greece or British India. In the Maghreb, hashish referred to cannabis resin, as it did in Mediterranean Arabic broadly. The term wasn't particularly prominent though, and resin was not significantly produced in the Maghreb until after 1950. Indeed, the use of cannabis resin in the Maghreb was first faintly evident only in 1884, when the Ottoman Tunisian government banned imports of chara. This term, meaning cannabis resin, was earliest documented as shira in Syrian Arabic in the 1790s. In the Maghreb, the proper names for the drug plant were kif and takruri, terms that also referred to herbal material prepared for smoking. The earliest Maghrebian documentation of psychoactive cannabis is from Morocco, from 1735. Marabouts likely began using cannabis around the same time, calling it kif. Kif was a widely used Arabic term for a state of deep mental and spiritual awareness. In the 1800s, Muslims around the Mediterranean made kif as a euphemism for using cannabis, tobacco, or other substances. Notably, the earliest certain appearance of psychoactive cannabis farming within the United States came in 1895, when Arabs, Armenians, and Turks grew kif in California to supply fellow immigrants in San Francisco. In Morocco and Algeria, kif became a nickname for cannabis, meaning roughly the high. In Algeria and Tunisia, the drug plant was called takruri. This word originated with a transcontinental dispersal from south of the Sahara, and not from connections across the Mediterranean. By 1500, cannabis was growing widely in North Africa and in the infra-Saharan region north of the Zambezi River and east of the Great Lakes. The plant was not omnipresent in these areas. Its range expanded in subsequent centuries through overland dispersals, whether traveling as a trade item, a useful plant, or an opportunistic weed. I can sketch the plant's movement along 4 broad pathways after 1500. As these overland dispersals progressed, the plant arrived at new points along the coast, too, on European ships. The Nile River is the easiest pathway through the Sahara. Cannabis certainly traveled along the valley via fields and weedy patches ever since it arrived in the river basin. However, this trans-Saharan passage does not seem to have shaped cannabis distribution significantly. The term hashish was not documented south of what is now the country of Sudan, except as written by European travelers. Conversely, cannabis terms documented in what is now South Sudan, like Luvonjaga and Zandebangi, did not travel north along the river. Bango, meaning herbal cannabis in Egypt and Sudan, likely came from Red Sea sailors, not up the Nile. The only clear instance of a trans-desert dispersal comes from the Algerian and Tunisian plant name takruri. In Arabic, the base meaning of takruri is from takrur. The imprecise geographic term takrur could refer to the entire Sudan region from Senegal to Ethiopia, or to specific areas within that region. Most relevantly, it could name an area centered on the Darfur region in the present-day country of Sudan. The term takruri was commonly used at Mecca, where it referred to pilgrims from across the Sudan region. As a name for cannabis, takruri was first published in the late 1700s in Algeria, where it named the plant as well as smoked cannabis. The plant name takruri was not documented in the country of Sudan, where the earliest evidence of cannabis came in 1799 when an Englishman reported hashish farming in Darfur. Importantly, in 1903, the plant name takruri was recorded south of the Sahara, but far from Darfur, near Zinder, Niger, just west of Lake Chad. It was spoken there in the unrelated languages Hausa, Tamashek, and Chadian Arabic. From this limited evidence, I hazard to guess a dispersal history. There was a group of Muslim pilgrims from Darfur who, after visiting Mecca in 1504, went forth to settle an area at the northern edge of Abyssinia. These pilgrims traveled in well-armed and wealthy masses. The settlers seized control of trade between Abyssinia and Ottoman Egypt and established the Fung Kingdom. They were called Takruri, referring to their Darfurian origins. Their new land straddled the confluence of the White Nile and the Blue Nile, a strategic location that likely led them to discover psychoactive cannabis via contacts in the uppermost Nile Valley. In the 1700s, some of their number carried the plant drug toward Mecca, where fellow pilgrims learned about the plant from people they called takruri. Knowledge and probably seeds returned to various societies, but the name persisted only in Algeria and Tunisia. The plant was already known in these countries and elsewhere along the Mediterranean seaboard. Perhaps cannabis smoking was previously unknown. In the late 1700s in Algeria, the plant was called both takruri and chinab, the latter name recalling more ancient understandings of the plant. Subsequently, the plant traveled overland from the Maghreb toward Lake Chad. A northward crossing is unlikely. There is no evidence of cannabis in northern Central Africa before 1903. The town of Zinder had been within the Kanem-Bornu Empire, which had controlled trans-Saharan trade from Central Africa from about 1000 CE to 1850 and had maintained embassies from Egypt to Algeria. Cannabis may have crossed the Sahara through Kanem-Bornu's commercial networks. But if so, this happened only in the last decades of the empire's existence. The crossing may have occurred only at the end of the 19th century when takruri was a commercial commodity in Tunisia. There are no other examples of Arabic words used south of the Sahara for cannabis, even if Europeans commonly wrote the familiar term hashish. Further, cannabis has never been common in the Lake Chad Basin. Auguste Chevalier, a well-traveled French botanist, did not observe it during 15 years of activities in the basin during the early 20th century. The plant has been common in the Maghreb for centuries, and more reasonably dispersed from an area of abundance to one of rarity. Smoking is ancient in the Lake Chad Basin, at least in its southern portion, where archaeologists have recovered pipes as old as 600 BCE. But oral histories indicate that people smoked datura before cannabis. The plant's trans-Saharan travels are intriguing, but late and minor events in cannabis history. Its main movements were south of the Sahara, westward from East Africa. Cannabis arrived in northern Central Africa primarily from the south and east, rather than across the Sahara. This expansion probably occurred mostly after 1800, when cannabis accompanied commercial caravans under the Swahili name Bangi. There is scant historic evidence from the region north of the Congo Basin, where the plant has never seemed abundant. In the early 1900s, in what is now the Central African Republic, CAR, the botanist Chevalier considered the plant's northern limit to lie just beyond the dense equatorial forests. He doubtless overlooked some occurrences of the plant, which was already frowned on by colonial authorities, years before it was formally outlawed. In French Congo, in 1902, Chevalier found that smokers avoided using it in front of European travelers and generally grew only a few stems in concealed places that are difficult to observe. Nonetheless, north of the forest, the plant was uncommon, not just hidden. The only other published observations were among Zande speakers in what is now South Sudan. Documents from 1906, 1926, and 1956 describe well-established and discreet cannabis farming and use. The plant was supposed to have come to Zande lands from the southeast, the direction from which Swahili trade would have arrived. Indeed, in Zande, the plant is called bangi. In other South Sudanese languages, it is called something like njaga, as in Luvo, the northernmost known example of a cluster of similar Nja names centered on Uganda. Perhaps the plant traveled the northern margins of the equatorial forest under such a name. More certainly, by 1925, cannabis had gone westward to Nigeria under some derivative of the Swahili bangi, as evident in names such as Silela Vobaznya, northern Nigeria. It seemingly grew even farther west, in Togo, although its name there was not historically published. European colonial observers recorded this westward expansion, though only via generalizations. The stupefying or maddening hemp entered Congoland from the far Muhammadan northeast, announced an English administrator in the Belgian Congo in 1908. The notion that Arabs enabled the plant's westward dispersal is common but unsubstantiated. Arabic words did not accompany the plant or its drug use. Instead, the plant traveled with trade caravans, its range expanding with Swahili commerce in the 1800s. The people who carried bangi were porters, not the merchants who employed them. The merchants favored tobacco, especially imported from Persia. Only Burton suggests they smoked cannabis too. In 1857, he generalized about bangi in East Africa. The Arabs, i.e. caravan leaders, smoked the sun-dried leaf with, and the Africans, i.e. caravan porters, without tobacco. Burton was attentive to drugs. Other travelers may have overlooked cannabis among traders, especially if it was mixed with tobacco. In contrast, the plant drug was widely and consistently noted with commercial porteurs and paddlers. These men certainly called it bangi, among other names, because Swahili was the language of commerce. Bangi cognates occurred up and down the eastern Congo Basin, and in other widespread trade languages. such as Sango, spoken in the northern basin, and Lingala in the western basin. Bangi cognates also occur beyond Swahili areas along Africa's coastline from southern Mozambique to Nigeria. These coastal cognates likely trace to the Portuguese word bangue. Sailors on European ships, whether Europeans, South Asians, or Africans, carried the plant name, if not seeds, to the coast. Portuguese ships began visiting southeastern Africa in 1498. Portuguese in India had tried edible cannabis concoctions by 1540. Psychoactive cannabis is not documented on Portuguese ships. For comparison though, 17th and 18th century British sailors in South Asia and Madagascar used the plant drug, including one who encountered it in Ceylon, and knew only its Portuguese name. He valued it as an edible to treat stomach ills. South Asian lascars carried it on British ships, and some European sailors likely did too. In English, the Portuguese name was borrowed as bangoe by 1689, although by 1800, as British presence in India increased, the English word became bang and was considered a Hindi loanword. In areas of Portuguese influence in the Atlantic, historical names for cannabis clearly derive from bangoe and show that the plant drug circulated in Portugal's global trade networks. African cognates of bang trace ultimately to South Asia, but through a host of cultural intermediaries who cannot be certainly identified. South and west of the Zambezi, most plant names do not trace back to bang. Matokwane is a clear example, spoken in the related languages Lozi, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Tswana, Botswana, and southern Soto, Lesotho, South Africa. Cannabis, like other crops introduced from the north, first came to southeastern Africa as seeds passed between farmers. It likely circulated within the expansive kingdom of Zimbabwe, which persisted from the 1200s to the 1400s, and certainly within the successor kingdom of the Monomotapa, 1400s, 1700s. Both kingdoms were roughly centered on modern Zimbabwe. Pipes estimated to date from the 1200s have been recovered from sites that once lay within these kingdoms. The earliest pipes recovered in northern South Africa date to the 1400s. A Tonga oral history from southern Mozambique, published in 1910, included hemp pipes among the things legendary ancestors brought from the north. Whatever the plant's southern African prehistory might have been, when the documentary record began in the 1600s, its dispersal trajectory was not southward, but generally westward toward the Cape of Good Hope and northward from there. The written record for cannabis in southern Africa is tied to daga, the dominant word for cannabis in South Africa since 1700. Its meaning has been geographically and botanically inexact, which hampers interpretation of historical sources. Daga probably originated in a Western Cape Koena language, most of which have disappeared since Dutch settlers arrived in 1652. It was borrowed into Dutch-derived Afrikaans in Cape Town by 1658. Many European travelers initially encountered the unfamiliar drug use of cannabis at the Cape and transported the word with them. Consequently, Europeans wrote daga in southern African locations where people almost certainly use different terms. Outside this region, Europeans mentioned daga in contexts where it was irrelevant, just as those familiar with the Eastern Mediterranean wrote hashish more widely than warranted. In Koena languages, daga probably originally had a fluid meaning somewhere between drunkenness, green, and to smoke. It was perhaps related to the word canna, which refers to the plant genus Mesembryanthum, whose hallucinogenic roots were chewed straight or brewed into fermented drinks. European observers sometimes confused these and other plant names and often did not know which plants the names labeled. There are no accounts of oral cannabis consumption from southern Africa, yet two 17th century documents describe oral consumption of daga, seemingly because they meant Mesembryanthum. In 1686, a Swedish slaver decided that Koena people misbehaved only when drunk for having eaten some daca root, or drank some water where it was infused. Yet in 1713, daga was clearly cannabis. Subsequent works consistently agreed. A further complication is that while daga has labeled the mildly psychoactive plant Leonotis, a botanist first made this identification in 1785. He also identified hemp, which is cultivated both by the Hottentots and the colonists merely for replenishing the pipes of the former with it instead of tobacco. But he didn't supply its local name. Recent literature on cannabis suggests that people smoked Leonotis earlier than cannabis or tobacco, and that the term daga originally referred to Leonotis. However, this idea originates from an unreliable botany source from 1857. In reality, Leonotis, as well as elephant and rhinoceros dung, were desperate substitutes for cannabis or tobacco in the late 1700s. It is clear that Southern Africans had extensive knowledge of cannabis production and use. The best growing conditions were in the cool, moist climates of the coastal belt, from Eastern Cape Province to Natal, and in the highlands extending north to Zimbabwe. African farmers transformed cannabis by selecting plants for desired traits, with Southern Africa providing sufficient evidence of these practices. Across the continent, Europeans observed smokers saving seeds from cannabis flowers intended for smoking. In Mozambique in the 1790s, people harvested inflorescences for smoking, leaves for poultices, and stems for fiber, indicating agricultural selection towards smokers' preferences. Over time, smokers' preferences resulted in distinctive local gene pools, with natural selection favoring plants that could withstand ecological challenges. These prehistoric and historic seed selection practices produced a genetically distinct cannabis population in southern Africa, known for higher amounts of the cannabinoid THCV, an appetite suppressant. Cannabis has been valued as an appetite suppressant in southeastern Africa since at least the 1580s. By the late 1800s, cannabis was cultivated in irrigated fields in eastern South Africa, the only irrigated crop in contemporary Botswana. European settlers began growing cannabis by 1713, producing substantial quantities into the late 1800s. Afrikaner farmers in the 1820s stored cannabis as dried inflorescences, indicating their seed selection practices focused on drug effects. The THCV-rich cannabis lineage is valued today for its energizing and appetite-suppressing qualities. By the 1680s, and probably much earlier, cannabis was part of a Southern African exchange network between Ngalanja farmers and Kwena hunter-gatherers, stretching from eastern South Africa to southern Angola by the 1800s. This network evolved with increased European coastal activity, especially after 1652, with Dutch colonization of the Cape. Africans in eastern South Africa specialized in cannabis trading by 1668, including sales to European merchants. By the 1680s, Dutch ships also bought cannabis in Natal for Cape sales. European settlers participated in cannabis commerce by trading daga, alcohol, and tobacco for Kwena labor. Cannabis was generally less valuable than alcohol, tobacco, and mesembryanthum, which Europeans did not traffic. By 1657, settlers were growing tobacco to pay workers, and by 1713, they were growing daga, which was widespread and openly planted on settler farms. In the 1810s, daga was found in fenced, irrigated gardens alongside tobacco. African farmers continued growing cannabis, especially in river valleys, either separately or interplanted with food crops. Cannabis persisted in abandoned home sites and colonized disturbed ground. European travelers in the 1880s carried daga to share with people they encountered, spreading cannabis north into present-day Namibia. The plant also entered Namibia from the east through southeastern Africa exchange networks, and from the north through Angola, where Ovambo speakers introduced cannabis, tobacco, and pipes to Herero speakers. Europeans often lamented Southern Africans' lack of interest in cannabis fiber, despite attempts to establish hemp production. European hemp seeds planted in 1657 failed to thrive. Afrikaners found local cannabis plants outperformed European cultivars in the 1880s, and there was no commercially successful cannabis hemp production in South Africa. By 1908, small amounts of fiber were produced in Natal by crossing European sativa with African indica. Cannabis dispersed westward from eastern to western Central Africa, inferred from language, geography, and historical circumstances. 19th century European travelers documented later stages of this transcontinental journey. Western African cannabis likely traces back to the Lake Tanganyika Basin and lower Zambezi Valley, with similar plant names in various Ngalanjam languages across this region. These terms spread westward to Angola, north through the Congo Basin, and along the coast to Nigeria, and from Côte d'Ivoire to Senegal. Terms like Diamba, Liamba, and Yamba in Western Africa are cognates of the Ngalanjam plant names, showing uniformity despite regional variations. Cannabis probably traveled along the Zambezi River and its northern and southern edges, with significant dispersals occurring from the 1700s onward. The plant moved westward within Angola through slave trading networks, reaching the coast by the mid-1700s. Enslaved people from the upper Zambezi Valley and surrounding areas entered Atlantic commerce by 1700. The drug plant, known as chamba, spread to the Kwango to Lualaba area with the rise of the Lunda Empire. Cannabis farming in eastern Central Africa was documented in the 1870s, with terms like diamba used in local languages. By 1811-1848, about 21% of enslaved people from Angola originated from the Kwango to Lualaba area, indicating cannabis traveled alongside the slave trade. Cannabis began arriving in Angola by the mid-1700s, with documented cultivation near Luanda in 1803. Portuguese administrators in 1803 noted cannabis cultivation for smoking rather than fiber. By the 1840s, European travelers observed that slaves carried cannabis seeds. The plant traveled north from Angola into the Congo Basin and coastal areas, reaching Gabon by trade. Cannabis remained unfamiliar to Europeans in the lower Congo for years, but by the late 1800s, it was commercially shipped to Gabon and São Tomé. Canoe-based traders in the central Congo Basin carried cannabis for personal use, spreading it along rivers. By the early 1900s, cannabis was prominent along the southern, eastern, and western edges of the Congo Basin, but seemed a recent arrival to some travelers. Language features suggest cannabis's relative newness in the southern and western Congo Basin. Published cannabis vocabularies in these areas are less diverse than in southeastern Africa, with terms like diamba, liamba, riamba, and iamba predominating. Historical cannabis horticulture is best documented in Angola, where it was farmed near Luanda in 1803 and common around inland slave market towns by 1832. Cannabis was part of a cropping system adapted to periodic drought, warfare, and population shifts. It provided valued products and thrived in diverse conditions, planted as widely as manioc, maize, and tobacco, though rarely in abundance. By the late 1800s, cannabis was thriving widely in Angola. Cannabis and pipe smoking were ancient practices in Africa before European documentation. Distinctive cannabis use practices existed across the continent, with smoking being a highly mobile practice. This mobility helped spread cannabis from Africa's eastern to western shores and into the Atlantic world. The documentary record for cannabis is thin or absent for most locations south of the Sahara. Cannabis had multiple uses, primarily as a smoke drug. Cannabis fiber was significantly harvested only in Madagascar, where people made hemp fabric and had an extensive vocabulary for fiber processing and textile production. Elsewhere, cannabis fiber was not highly valued. In Mozambique in the 1790s, People made cordage from stems, but primarily smoked cannabis in fluorescences. By the late 1800s, cannabis fiber was rarely used in southern Tanzania. Cannabis was valued for psychoactive drugs, with few reports of oral consumption, such as in Mozambique in the 1580s, similar to contemporary accounts from India. No further records of edible preparations are found until around 1900, when Malagasy speakers had a term for a confection made of cannabis, sugar, and spices. Zanzibari Swahili included one Arabic loanword, majun, and two other terms for edible preparations. Cannabis chewing was rumored to be a Swahili pastime, while Lega speakers in the central Congo basin reportedly chewed dried, powdered plant material. Portuguese Angola's first cannabis control law, 1913, referred to chewing as an older practice that might persist in some areas. Nothing else is known of infra-Saharan cannabis edibles. Overwhelmingly, the plant drug was smoked, with few descriptions of cannabis processing available. Inflorescences were dried quickly before a fire or slowly under the sun, then hung indoors for storage. Special preparations were limited, but in the southern Congo basin, Songye women pounded cannabis herbal material in a mortar with salt, potash, cooking oil, and sometimes tobacco, shaping the mixture into cakes that were dried and stored for later use. These cakes may have been sold as little balls of cannabis along the lower Congo around 1880, although they could have been simply plant material compressed in shipment. In Angola, commercial shipments were packed in leaf-wrap packets, while in western Tanzania and southern Africa, people carried cannabis in banana leaves or corn husks. Compressed packaging may have also represented a curing technique, as described for South African daga in 1913. This preparation suggests a deep understanding of horticulture, ecology, pharmacology, and drug manufacturing, fields of knowledge likely present elsewhere as well. Currently, people in the lower Zambezi Valley ferment cannabis in corn husk packets to produce black Malawi, a product with different pharmacological effects from unfermented material. The most consistent context of use in the historical record is that cannabis was involved in labor relationships, with smoking on the job being widespread. It was rarely a form of payment, except in the earliest documented work-drug relationship, where Dutch settlers in South Africa began paying Kwena laborers with drugs in the 1650s. Daga wages were paid into the 20th century. Relationships among Daga, African workers, and European settlers are discussed in more detail in Chapter 8, which examines political ecologies of cannabis and labor. Broadly, the plant drug served as a stimulant, appetite suppressant, and euphoriant for workers across infra-Saharan Africa. Probably the most widely generalizable description of historic psychoactive cannabis use is a large pipe is passed round and each man takes a pull or two at it. This is the usual method of refreshment when halting for a short time on a journey. Alongside tobacco, people smoke the intoxicating hemp, chamba, or daka, which they say is, instead of food and drink, to them when they are tired. Social smoking was the norm, with musicians and dancers smoking while performing. Among Lunda speakers in the Kwango-Tolwalaba area in the 1880s, men cradled water pipes between their legs while playing thumb pianos, and men and women sang call and response while taking turns smoking. Nyamwezi men in western Tanzania smoked after dinner, in communal huts where they spent their nights gambling, eating, drinking beer, smoking bhang and tobacco, chatting, and sleeping. Smokers played games of strategy in eastern South Africa, documented in Swazi, Tonga, and Zulu societies. In these games, players made mock fences of frothy saliva bubbles blown through long reeds, while also trying to deposit lines of bubbles through gaps in opponents' fences. Cannabis was not stigmatized as a laborer's drug, with prosperous merchants smoking in the central Congo basin in the 1880s. People gave cannabis as gifts, from boyfriend to girlfriend, or as tributes to and between leaders and prominent visitors. Political leaders smoked during councils and as a pastime. The leader of the Lunda Empire in the 1880s was nicknamed Za Mariamba, or Master of Smoking Riamba. Coughing was a prominent feature in historical accounts, sometimes appearing as performance. Nyamwezi speakers had specific terms for cannabis coughing, while accounts suggest that coughing was sometimes appreciated as part of the smoking experience. In some cases, coughing was seen as a desirable consequence of smoking. Europeans were less observant of the plant drug's medicinal applications, with the best historical documentation pertaining to southern Africa. Most medicinal uses were not psychoactive, including cannabis, leaf, poultices, reported in Mozambique in the 1790s. Soto women smoked to relieve pain during childbirth, while Zulu herbalists and people in Sierra Leone prescribed cannabis smoke to treat chest complaints. Afrikaners developed practices of cannabis use built on European, Ngalanjam, and Kowena precedents, using cannabis medicinally as early as 1835. Cannabis was generally considered therapeutic, with liberated slaves from Angola considering diamba useful against all complaints in 1843. Many laborers valued cannabis to self-manage mental health, finding it sometimes therapeutic. The subjective effects of cannabis sometimes merged into spirituality, but there is scant evidence that cannabis had any formal, sacramental roles in African belief systems. Kowena groups used psychoactive substances to intensify trances for spiritual communication. But this use was not documented until the late 19th century. In some cases, cannabis served political religious movements, with formal theologies including sacramental cannabis arising in the African diaspora, and esoteric movements appearing on the continent, such as the Sirdar movement in present-day South Sudan around 1912. The Sirdar movement is no more than a rumor from one colonial officer. Yet, it is worth mentioning as a parallel to the Benariamba political religious movement, the most famous tale of cannabis in Africa. The Benariamba movement, spanning from 1870 to 1890, unfolded within the Lulua River Valley at the heart of the Kwango to Lualaba region. The portrayal of the Benariamba in cannabis histories often aligns with contemporary political perspectives, downplaying the risks and emphasizing potential benefits of the plant drug. According to prevailing narratives, cannabis fostered universal friendship among Benariamba adherents, leading to the cessation of warfare. However, this romanticized depiction overlooks the movement's historical significance as a pivotal moment in the integration of cannabis into Central Africa's Congo Basin. Contrary to the notion of cannabis promoting peace, the Benariamba context was primarily political, serving as a tool for authoritarian control and violence amid political and economic upheaval. Beyond the confines of the Benariamba, cannabis played a multifaceted role, aiding individuals in preparing for and recovering from trauma, thus facilitating its spread across new territories. The late 1800s witnessed a transformative period in the southern Congo Basin, marked by the exploitation of resources like rifles, rubber, ivory, and slaves, leading to widespread violence and power struggles among African empires and European colonizers. The Benariamba thrived amid this turmoil, forming alliances with external forces seeking to assert dominance over uncharted lands. Several factors contributed to the political economic opportunities in the Kwango to Lualaba area during this era, including the decline of established African powers like the Lunda and Luba empires, paving the way for new political movements and identities to emerge. The Benariamba represented an uprising against traditional authorities, reflecting broader socio-cultural changes within African communities. Other groups, such as the Kokwe and Zapozap, also sought autonomy and commercial interests, further reshaping the regional landscape. The geopolitical competition among European powers for colonial dominance culminated in the Berlin Conference of 1884-85, formalizing the partitioning of Africa. while diplomatic negotiations shaped colonial boundaries. On the ground, conflicts and shifting alliances between African leaders and European interlopers fueled violence and exploitation. The Congo Free State epitomized this era of greed-driven colonialism, with atrocities committed in pursuit of wealth and power. The Benariamba's trajectory mirrored the broader patterns of colonial conquest and resistance, with its leaders navigating alliances with external forces to maintain their influence. However, as colonial control solidified and internal power struggles intensified, the movement's significance waned, ultimately fading into obscurity by the turn of the 20th century. Despite its decline, the Benariamba left a lasting legacy, underscoring the complex interplay between cannabis, politics, and social upheaval in Central Africa. Cannabis, entrenched in the region's cultural and historical fabric, was not merely a recreational or spiritual indulgence, but also a strategic tool in navigating power dynamics and coping with the trauma of colonial exploitation. Its enduring presence in Central Africa underscores its adaptive significance in times of social and political turmoil. While the specific motivations and experiences of cannabis users in historical contexts remain elusive, its role in facilitating resilience and resistance against colonial oppression merits further examination.
Join the Comgiverse Patreon for exclusive content, behind-the-scenes access, and special perks. Support the channel and connect with a community of revolutionary intellectuals and scholars. Click the link in the description to join now.